not entirely sure that we even put the right person in prison. But how do you put a system that chews up children in prison?
Everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
We're back. It's been a little bit of a break. We know you've been checking the YouTube every day for our latest content. We send our apologies. Dr. Kristen's voice died. Like died. Really died. And so we had to push back this coverage that we had planned. But we're here. We're excited to continue our conversation of the opioid epidemic because everything went so well with our coverage of Dopesick. And by well, I mean we got a great reception from a lot of folks. We got a lot of new subscribers. Hello, new subscribers.
Hi, pals.
Hey, pals. We got, I'm going to brag just for a hot second. We got some lovely comments from Danny Strong, who is the creator and director, producer, and head writer of Dopesick, which was very, very kind of him. We got some love from Benjamin Rubin, who has also been on our channel subsequently to do a great Welcome to My World with Dr. Kristen. But Benjamin was one of the staff writers on Dopesick. So if you're interested in Dopesick and you followed our coverage, or you're interested in continuing conversations about the opioid epidemic, follow those two folks on Twitter. And we send our thanks to several of our friends and subscribers who recommended The Pharmacist, which is what we're here to talk about today, because they were like, if you talk about Dopesick, have you seen The Pharmacist? And we were like, what are you talking about? We haven't. Now we have. And we're here to talk to you about it today. So this is a Netflix limited docu-series that premiered in 2020. So no surprise it passed us by. And there's 4 episodes to it. And so we're going to talk about episode 1 today. And this one is called Justice for Danny. And this tale of The Pharmacist is the tale of a man named Dan Schneider, who is a pharmacist in outside New Orleans in Louisiana. He is born and raised, I believe, in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, which is right next to the lower 9th Ward, just outside, I believe, New Orleans proper, although I could be wrong if St. Bernard Parish is a part of New Orleans. I don't know. But that is where he is from. And it is the story of kind of how he became this de facto vigilante detective to get justice first for his son, who was murdered in the lower 9th Ward, attempting to purchase heroin. I'm not sure. I think it was cocaine, though.
I wrote down crack. So
yeah, I wrote down crack as well. So his son was murdered, and so he first attempts to get justice for Danny, hence the title of this episode. But it leads him down the rabbit hole Dr. Kristen and I have fallen down as well. And, Beth Macy fell down when she wrote Dopesick, and the creators of Dopesick fell down as well, which is the great cavern of the opioid epidemic in the United States. So eventually that's where it leads Dan Schneider, and that will lead us through our coverage. But this episode is really about introducing kind of the specifics of St. Bernard Parish and the lower 9th Ward, and how they were impacted by the crack epidemic, how they have dealt with subsequent, police systems and drug companies and all of this jazz. So we did a lot of setting the stage And we get to Dan's introduction of his son, Danny, like Dan Schneider Jr. And he really starts to struggle with what to do with his life after high school and college. And in April 1999, he is found shot dead in the lower Ninth Ward. And as at this point, we should say one of the more difficult parts of this show was Dan and his wife, and I don't have her name written in front of me, I apologize, Dan's wife, did video recordings, like tape recordings, like almost therapy sessions, talking through what was happening to them. This eventually
physically, like, he audio recorded everything.
And this eventually leads to him, like, illegally audio recording, like, a whole bunch of people.
His relationship with wiretapping is real loose. Real loose. In a way that reminded me, hilariously, of Linda Tripp. A little bit.
I was like, you guys both have, like, the same loose understanding of another person's rights.
Of another person's consent to being recorded. Yeah. Oof.
But the audio recordings of Dan and his wife during this time of they found Danny's body and then are trying to find out what happened to him just, like, absolutely broke me. Absolutely broke me. And then he starts to record, like, everybody else. Because we learned that the New Orleans police department had a reputation at that time in the mid to late 90s of being the murder capital in the United States and of having a deeply corrupt police department.
I want to say that at this point, there's probably 7 to 10 murder capitals of the United States.
Yeah.
So if you're watching this and you're like, no, I thought that was L.A. Camden was, Detroit was, Atlanta was, Chicago was. So just so you're aware, in the 90s, everywhere that had people of color was a murder capital, to be honest.
Legit. But they had, I think, over 100 police officers suspended.
Yeah. It was problem.
In the course of a calendar year.
One calendar year.
Year.
That's an issue.
For misconduct. Like, y'all. That's a big
It's
big
almost
problem.
Impressive.
Like, hats off.
Damn.
You committed to that corruption.
You committed to being the worst. And, like, all we can do to that is just applaud. I mean, come on. Come on. No one, like, you watch this kind of thing, and slight tangent, but it reminds me again of with the fallacy of saying to anyone who is a victim of a crime, well, just go to the cops.
Yeah.
Why didn't you report? Not, like, of any level of crime, the fallacy of going to your local police at times.
Honestly, yeah. And so much of, I think, they don't get into it specifically over the course of this series, but it's a huge subtext. I think you can infer a lot from the response of the police department and certain, officers and detectives and stuff that, like, that's it. This whole story is a huge case for why. And, like, eventually when we get into later episodes and Dan is investigating this doctor and, like, the New Orleans Police Department are helping her run her pill mill. So, like, he was right to be skeptical. Was he right to illegally record police officers? I don't think...
We're going to fall down on the side of the ends did not justify the means, but your mileage may vary.
Correct. And, we're empathy educators, and so we've cracked a lot of jokes at the start of this, but we should say, like, we can 100% empathize with
100
everything Dan Schneider did.
Absolutely.
Everything. Empathy, though, understanding is not condoning. It does not mean we condone his actions. So he channels all of his grief into finding out what happened to his son. He starts to record the police because he felt they weren't being helpful. And then the rest of the episode is about him becoming this advocate for his son and trying to find out what happened. Particularly within the community of the Lower Ninth Ward. He goes to a bunch of churches in the area. He goes to community leaders. He walks around handing out pamphlets. He raises money for a $10,000 reward. And we also get introduced at this time to a man named Jeffrey, who we're not sure why we're introduced to him at the beginning, but it eventually is revealed that he witnessed or said that he witnessed Danny's murder. So there's a whole lot of time pressuring Danny, trying to get him to come forward, all this stuff. And then I just read one of my notes, like, I was going to read about introducing this woman named Shane, and then I was like, are we going to talk about the fact that he recorded people all the time without their consent? The documentary does not. The docuseries does not deal with this at all, which is hilarious. He called everybody in the neighborhood and recorded conversations. Like, I want to know how much money that man spent, because this was the late 90s, y'all, on tapes.
Yeah, and long-distance phone calls. What was his phone bill?
What was that phone bill? You know, pharmacists make good money. They made good money then, they make good money now. I had a friend that went to pharmacology school to become a pharmacist and, like, immediately paid off his student loan debt. Like, within a year. They make good money. But yeah. Whew. So a witness comes forward after all this pressure that he's put on the community. A witness named Shane comes forward, who saw what happened to Danny and who saw that it was, in fact, Jeffrey who murdered him.
Just so you know, Jeffrey was 15 at the time that this happened.
15 at the time. Yes, that's a huge part of this piece. His mother was an addict as well, which led him very early on. I think in the story he was like 9 or 10. He got involved in like drug trafficking and drug dealing because he was just around it all the time with his mother. And so Shane comes forward. She is afraid that something is going to happen to her from retaliation from Jeffrey or the community. And so what does Dan do? He basically stalks her. He calls her all the time. He calls her family. He records conversations. She moved. She changed her number. Her family is being harassed. And then finally, the daughter, Dan and his wife. I didn't write down her name, you guys. I'll look it up before the next one. Christy, I did write down her name, their daughter, writes a letter to Shane about Danny and about going to the police or whatever. So Shane goes to the police. She gets threatened so much she enters witness protection. And they find her anyway, they being Jeffrey, people in the community, whatever. And that's the end of the episode. So I was a little confused, I'm not going to lie, by the time we got to the end of the episode, because the intro film, like the credits, talk about how he gets so mad about Oxy and like that's his like mission. And then we spent 45 minutes of him being a police detective. But we will get to the Oxy. But it's a crazy ass story. Dr. Kristen, what would you like to say about justice for Danny?
I have a couple things. One is that the word justice is so complicated because in order to get justice for his son, he uprooted the lives of hundreds of other people, possibly. And who deserves justice versus all those kind of things. Then there's the cultural difference of I will get truth at any cost versus we do not snitch ever.
Yeah.
So there's that. Then there's the idea of what grief does, and it like brings ferality. Like it almost makes us feral sometimes, and that's almost what he was. So we could talk about all that. I could talk forever about how I am deeply sympathetic to how much he must have, what grief he was in. I find none of his actions justified. And so it's really difficult for me to like root for him, I guess, like as a protagonist. Like the whole time he was doing this, I was like, I am just such a fan of consent. But so there's that. But what I want to talk about like largely is the machine of drugs the apparatus of it. So there's a lot of different facets. There's a lot of different ways to talk about drugs. There's a lot of different, obviously, words that people use and everything else. It is a massive business, which means that it is a massive machine. Mm. And it eats children. It eats children all over the world.
Chews them up and spits them back out.
Against their consent. Because we legally have decided that nobody under the age of 14 knows themselves or the world enough that they can consent to anything, pretty much. So, like, there's very few exceptions to that. I think there's some states that let people pick which parent they want to live with, but, like, that's the extent.
Yeah.
We do not believe that they have the ability to consent to things before the age of 14. And around the world, one of the bodies that keep this machine going are children. Mm. And so I wanted to remind us of that, regardless of what you feel about this thing, regardless if you are pro, full legalization, pro everything. Just remember there is a point at which somebody gets involved against their consent. Mm. And that's kind of a thing we need to keep in mind, while also remembering to not demonize anyone who is a part of this. Yeah. Because it is unproductive. Like, even the Sacklers, who I want to see run out of town on a rail, demonizing them is unproductive.
Yeah, I mean, dehumanizing is never the answer. It's often the gut reaction. Yeah. When we're faced with horrible things. Yeah. But it is deeply unproductive.
And there's some messy stuff here that, like, even as we get into the later episodes, I don't love exactly how it explores it, to be honest, of the connections between quote-unquote illegal drugs and quote-unquote prescription drugs and kind of where all of that boundary is. I don't think they tease that quite well. So just spoiler alert, we are going to be more critical of this. At least I will be than we were of Dope Sick. Yeah. So for sure, I think there's some real narrative holes in this that are not filled well. And one of them is how we talk about addicts and how we talk about people who use the drugs, especially once we get into the opiate conversation, the people who are on monitored care using the drugs positively, and kind of all of that kind of stuff. We don't really talk about it. But especially in the 90s, no one was having positive conversations about drugs at all.
Oh,
We're
absolutely
on the heels of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No. We are under the assumption nationally that the only people dying from crack are Black people, so therefore we do not care nationally. And we are still under the delusion that nice white suburban kids do not do recreational drugs.
And we also have the hyper-militarization of police forces across the country
beginning to happen
as a result of President Clinton's crime bill. So those things are like happening in conjunction.
All at once. So there's a lot of context that I wish they would have gone into a little bit more. This is one of those times in which it's like my kingdom for a sociologist. Like, there are so many criminologists that could have really added some weight to this and really unpacked some of this stuff that could have made it a lot heavier. And I just will forever wish that someone would have addressed the fact that he was doing this illegally. And the cost to... I don't think this episode especially really emphasized enough the cost to Dan's family and to Shane.
Yeah, and I mean, I think your point about children was so well made, and that's an important point to remember specifically about Jeffrey in this episode. Yeah. But as well, we learned that Shane's brother was murdered when she was 12, and they never found out what happened to him. We talk, this episode introduces a lot of differences racially and socioeconomically between St. Bernard Parish and the Lower Ninth Ward. And I appreciate the lack of self-awareness that Dan Schneider shows in this.
And I mean, it's very authentic.
It's very authentic. And, when you're so in your grief, on I wouldn't expect it necessarily from him. In some of the reflections as he's talking about what happened, I'm like, it was fascinating. And, you know, some voiceovers that we get from Shane and from other folks in the community talking about, like, when white people show up in the lower Ninth Ward, it's for buying drugs or insurance salesmen.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the same in under-resourced neighborhoods all over the country.
All over the country. And I would love to talk about for just a minute what you said about justice and the idea of what is justice. And what does justice mean for the Schneider family? Mm. What does justice mean for Dan versus his wife versus his daughter?
Yeah, because we hear their voices being like, could you just please put the tape recorder away?
Yeah. Could you just stop recording everything all the time? You know, your kingdom for a sociologist, my kingdom for a therapist for these folks.
Yep.
Would have gone a long way. And there's almost no critique from the filmmakers in terms of what's happening.
Yeah, it's a real laissez-faire style that I'm not sure this topic warranted.
Yeah, because we don't ever get an outsider in terms of a person analyzing this story, like a sociologist or a criminologist or a therapist. And I think it would have been so much richer to provide the context for why people in this much grief and this much pain, like, behave the way Dan is behaving.
Yeah.
I can 100% understand his almost vigilante level behavior.
Oh, for sure.
Absolutely can't say, like, yep, okay, buddy, keep doing what you're doing. And the almost, like, laser focus, the complete narrow-mindedness to not understand that he was traumatizing his wife, he was traumatizing his daughter. He forced Shane to, like, uproot her life and move because he was harassing her so much at the cost. And, you know, it's easy for us to say, it's easy for us as outsiders, it's easy for us as white folks to say, well, why couldn't Shane just go to the police? Why wouldn't she just agree to testify? Like, she knows what happened. Why doesn't she just tell the truth? But we have no idea what she was facing. We learn some of it as she is intimidated into moving, intimidated into joining witness protection, and still found by members of her community who do not want her to say what happened. But, like, what does justice mean?
Yeah.
And it's so racialized. Obviously, we've seen a lot of this in the last couple of years, and maybe as a society we're grappling with it more as we deal with the murder of George Floyd and the extrajudicial killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the acquittal of Kyle Rittenhouse and all of these things. And we see, you know, how broken the criminal justice system is and how racialized the idea of justice is. And I would have loved to have a sociologist or an anthropologist come in and say, like, because Dan Schneider is a white man, he has this unfailing belief that he can get justice for his son.
Yeah.
through almost any means necessary.
Any means necessary. And this is also where, like, I should confess that, like, I don't believe that people going to jail for a crime is necessarily justice. And so it might be, and I think we use jail far too broadly.
Too easily.
And I think that Jeffrey didn't have any other choice in his life. He could not have killed Danny Schneider. Absolutely. But he was 15 and he's not fully cooked as a human. And we shoved him into that world. And so I'm not entirely sure that we even put the right person in prison. But how do you put a system that chews up children in prison? Right. And what does that kind of look like? And so all of that, I have never lost a child because I've never birthed one. So I understand that, like, my my understanding is limited.
Right.
But I do know that I carry into this situation a deep skepticism of the prison system, not only in the United States but around the world, and that it does anything it says on the tin, except maybe in Sweden where the numbers are better, or Norway, is that where the numbers are good for rehabilitation?
Yeah,
but
it's one of those Scandinavian countries.
It's one of the places where we eat a lot of fish. So the whole time that he kept fighting for justice, I just kept looking at my computer screen saying, for whom?
For whom? Yeah.
For whom? And how do you think this makes anything better? And I think the thing for me too is like, it doesn't bring Danny back. So what is justice? Why it doesn't help anyone to not get eaten by this machine. So I don't understand his modus operandi, which then means that, again, he's not to me a sympathetic or relatable character. But I know he would be a deeply relatable character for some fathers I've met who wish they could have done what he did to the people that murdered their kids.
Yeah, and I think, like, we've talked a lot about the grief that he is facing, but clearly, and we get this in later episodes, there's so much guilt.
Oh my God, yeah.
That they didn't know that Danny was using, and completely his death. And they refused to believe at first that he was found in the lower Ninth Ward and that it was a drug deal gone bad. Because that was absolutely not their son, and they had no idea that he was using at all.
Yeah. I know the fastest way to make me believe something is something, by the way, is when somebody goes, well, my kid would never do that. And I just go, oh, then they're guilty. Or, oh, then they're dead. Like the minute, it's like a dog whistle on a TV show these days.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
That's not my son. Oh, child.
Oh, but it is.
Oh, but it is.
Yeah, and we get into the guilt a little bit more later on. And I can, it's just, God, it breaks my heart because I can't imagine how painful it must be to think that it's your fault that your child is dead.
Yeah, I can't imagine carrying that. I know somebody who carries that, and it is.
I mean, I think we talk about Oxy. Like, we talked about Oxy a lot in Dopesick, rewriting your brain, and trauma rewrites your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
it definitely does.
This trauma rewrote his brain so much. That he eventually, as we get into the later episodes, he turns to, trying to save as many folks as possible from Oxy, because he couldn't save his son. And that I can sympathize with more.
Yeah.
Than this.
That's a cause versus a crusade. And I'm usually on board with causes, and I'm rarely on board with crusades.
On board with crusades. Yeah, so this episode ended on a cliffhanger I was not expecting. With Shane still being threatened. This is like, these first two episodes are way more like crime drama than Oxycontin.
And you're not here for true crime. I was like, am I watching something on ID channel? Like, what is happening?
I know, I was like, am I watching America's Most Wanted? Like, what is happening? So we'll see what happens next in episode 2. Maybe we get Shane's testimony. Maybe we get the trial. What happens to Jeffrey? We'll find out. Almost nobody benefits, as you said, from being put into the criminal justice system as it currently stands, save for, like, mass murderers or pedophiles
or
serial abusers of any ilk. But especially, you just know it's not going to go well for Jeffrey. You just know. And it reminds me of, the age of the boys, of the exonerated 5, and how young they were when they were wrongfully accused and convicted of, murdering a woman in Central Park. If you guys don't know them by the moniker Exonerated 5, they were often called the Central Park 5. And they were I think only Corey was over 18. The rest of them were 15, 16 years of age. And the trauma of the trial and the trauma of their incarceration is documented extensively in the Netflix series When They See Us. And I couldn't help but thinking of those boys when we saw Jeffrey. So I don't feel good about that, about what's going to happen with that. But we'll be here for it either way.
Yep. In the meantime, we would love for you to subscribe to our channel if you've liked our content and you like this conversation. We would deeply appreciate a like of this video because it really matters to the algorithm, and therefore it matters to YouTube, and we can invite more people to this conversation that we're trying to do. If you've liked us as people and our thought process, good news. Not only are we on the YouTubes, but we have a weekly newsletter, and we'd love for you to subscribe to that so you can get our takes on all of the various things. The link is below, and you'll get a QR code on the closing side. If you just want to pop up, if you're watching on your computer, you want to pop up your phone, hit a little button, and there that goes. In the meantime, we hope wherever we find you as well as can be in these times. And we'll see you as soon as we can. Bye.
Bye, everybody.